Hi, I'm Bob Kiter. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this first of this semester Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag. I have the pleasure of directing the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. While we regret that we're meeting virtually today by virtue of the pandemic that everyone is familiar with, we will be managing our spring Green Bag series virtually online. We're pleased that we're able to do that. We appreciate the expertise of the College of Law's technical team that enables us to do that. And we likewise appreciate everyone joining us via Zoom today. We'll do the same with future programs this spring and hope that we'll be able to meet in person before too much longer. Before we get started, just a couple of calendar notices. On February 18th for noon Green Bag presentation, we'll be hosting Professor Jason Robeson from the University of Wyoming, who is the editor of the book Vision and Place, John Wesley Powell and Reimagining the Colorado River Basin. Jason will be joined by myself, my colleague, Professor Bob Adler, and Professor Emeritus Dan McCool. Each of us wrote chapters in Professor Robeson's book, and we're looking forward to having a joint discussion about land, water, and tribal issues in the Colorado River Basin, both past, present, and future. I should note that on March 11th, we'll host a Green Bag presentation by officials from the St. George area who will address the Lake Powell pipeline. You may recall, some of you, that we had a presentation on the Lake Powell pipeline during the fall. We'll hear another angle on the Lake Powell pipeline story then. And then on March 25th and 26th, we're very pleased to host the 26th annual Wallace Stegner Center annual symposium, this year on the plastics paradox, societal boon or environmental bane. Information is available online at the Stegner Center website. Registration is now open, and you can check the website and check the calendar of events there to get information. I also would like to take this opportunity to extend our most sincere thanks to the Cultural Vision Fund, which provides funding for our Green Bag series, as well as a number of other Stegner Center programs and events throughout the year, including our Young Scholar program. With that, I will introduce our speaker today. Again, we're very pleased to have everyone join us. Very timely topic. And I should note also that Kurt's book about rebisoning the West is available for sale from the King's English bookstore, which the Stegner Center has partnered with regularly for these Green Bag series. With that, let me introduce Kurt. He and I go back to our days in Wyoming, which is quite a few years ago. But he has continued. I got to know him as a journalist there. He has continued his journalism career. He's an award-winning journalist who has spent most of his career focusing on public lands, wildlife, recreation, environmental issues, development issues across the West. After graduating from West Virginia University, Kurt was hired by the Associated Press. He worked for them for a number of years, and then 1988 happened. Kurt was in Wyoming. That's when the wildfires swept across Yellowstone National Park. He directed and provided coverage of those fires for the Associated Press. Since then, he's continued to work in the area of journalism. He's written about the biodiversity found within Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and perhaps more importantly, he's launched and oversees the National Parks Traveler. That's the world's top-rated editorially independent website dedicated to daily news and feature coverage of the national parks and protected areas. He keeps us all informed about what's happening within the American national park system and even beyond the national park system. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Kurt to carry on and tell us what's happening with bison across the Western United States. There are exciting things happening today. Kurt, let me thank you on behalf of the Stegner Center and everyone on the call today for joining us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. That was certainly a glowing recommendation. I'll have to take you with me on the road from now on. I do my best communicating at a keyboard, so accept my apologies up front for any stumbling I'm sure I will do going forward as we talk about bison for the next 45 minutes or so. It's a little trip I want to take you on that spans roughly 200,000 years and roughly half the globe. I set out on that journey back in January of 2017. I was at a national parks conference back in Washington, D.C., and ran into Dan Wenk, the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park at the time. And Dan kind of lamented to me that he was not able to encourage the national newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, to do a deep look at the brucellosis issue in Yellowstone National Park. Brucellosis is a disease that wildlife carry that causes their spontaneous abortion. Interestingly enough, it's a disease that wildlife contracted from domestic cattle herds back in the early 1900s. Now, as founder and editor-in-chief of National Parks Traveler, I told Dan that we'd definitely love to take a deep dive into that story. After all, we didn't have any newsprint costs to worry about. And so I reached out to a colleague of mine up in Wyoming, Angus Thurmer Jr., who works for a nonprofit news organization up there. And the two of us collaborated on telling the story of the brucellosis issue in Yellowstone National Park and the conflicts with ranchers in Montana and Wyoming. And we reached out to not only the Park Service, but also the U.S. Forest Service, the states of Wyoming and Montana, Native American tribes, even ranchers, to try and cover all angles of that story. And as I worked on developing this story, a bigger story came to mind, and that was the decision in 2008 by Interior Secretary Dirk Kempthorne to launch a bison conservation initiative. While the Yellowstone brucellosis story is definitely important and merits coverage because of the impacts on the wildlife, not just in Yellowstone National Park, but in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the surrounding states, the Bison Conservation Initiative looks at the Midwest and the West and tries to identify areas where bison can be placed back on the landscape. Now, the story, as I said, isn't really a new one. It dates back 200,000 years roughly to when bison first crossed the Bering Land Strait to get to North America from Asia. And when they arrived in North America, they found just expansive grasslands that were lush and wonderful for them to, set up new populations and roam about. They also encountered some of the local residents, which included dire wolves and saber-toothed tigers and American lions. In other words, it was a pretty tough place to be a prey species on the continent. Now, we have a hint of what these bison from thousands of years ago looked like, because one of them, a steppe lion of roughly 35 or 36,000 years ago, was attacked by an American lion or a pack of American lions. And we know that because back in 1979, during the summer of 79, a husband and wife team of gold prospectors in Alaska were hydraulicking in a creek bed north of Anchorage. And what hydraulicking is basically you've got this high-powered hose, fire hose type looking hose that shoots out a strong stream of water, and it's used to basically wash away the vegetation and rocks and dirt from a hillside with hopes that you'll uncover gold ore. And if you've seen Clint Eastwood's movie Pale Rider, you know exactly how powerful this technique can be. Now, while the Romans didn't initially find gold, at least not that I know of, what they did find, arguably just as precious, was a steppe bison. One day, while they were wielding their hydraulicking hose back and forth across the hillside, all of a sudden they saw this blast uncover the rear end of a rather large looking animal. The couple summoned Dr. Dale Guthrie. He's a paleobiologist at the University of Alaska, and they asked him to come out to the creek bed and take a look and try and figure out what this animal was. So Guthrie walked across this muddy creek bed, looked up at the hillside, and saw a Paleolithic puzzle staring him back, rather ingloriously, butt first from the hillside. Now, being a good scientist with all his sensors on high alert, Guthrie was struck by the smell as he approached the long dead animal's hindquarters. As he put it, it was a rich, pungent rottenness, like nothing else I have smelled. It was a rottenness aged for the millennia in the frost, not a stench, not a stench, but a sweet, intense tang. The creature was nicknamed Blue Babe, both for its size and because there was a chemical reaction between the minerals in the soil and the animal's hide that left it with a blue tint. Now, Guthrie saw that the thawing animal was quickly taken back to the university and placed in a walk-in freezer until a taxidermist could get to it and prepare it for display. Now, during his necropsy on the carcass, Guthrie concluded that an American lion or lions had tried to kill the bison. He deduced that from actual claw marks and bite marks on the bison's hide. And apparently what had happened was somehow the bison had managed to flee the attack, but later died from its injuries and was quickly covered by a mudslide or something similar, and then just frozen in place in the soil. An interesting aside to Guthrie's work on Blue Babe was that he actually saved some of the meat from the carcass and later made a celebratory stew of sorts to really enjoy the meal. You can find more details on that in my book. Now, part of what makes this story so fascinating is how far bison spread across the North American continent. They went as far as Virginia in the east and down through Georgia, possibly reaching Florida, the northern end of Florida, the Panhandle. They went down through Texas, across the Rio Grande into Mexico, and far north into Canada. It's been estimated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that when Columbus reached the New World, there were possibly 65 million bison on the landscape. That's an incredible number. To try and put some perspective on it, if you were driving from, say, Kansas City to Denver across the country on the interstate, and you look to the north, you would see bison. You look to the south, you would see bison. You might even be stopped for several hours on the interstate as a herd of bison crossed from north to south or south to north. Some of these herds were 15 miles long. We know that from some of the written accounts of Civil War officers who went west after the Civil War and encountered these bison on the landscape. Now, of course, that number of bison really couldn't stand up to humans. As the Western expansion pushed through, by the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were only several hundred bison in the United States. Most of those were in private ranches, private reserves. There were thought to be 24 left in the wild, and those 24 were deep inside Yellowstone National Park up in the Central Plateau. What happened to those 65 million bison? Well, the Great Slaughter, that's what happened. Bison were wiped out largely by buffalo hunters who had come out to kill bison to sell to the railroads to feed to the railroad workers. Along the way, they discovered that not only was the meat saleable, but also the bones, the skulls, and the leg bones, which were ground up into fertilizers, and the bison hides or robes were treasured as well. And then the military also had an interest in wiping out the bison. They figured that if they took the bison off the landscape, it would deprive the Native American cultures in the area of basically their commissary. After all, bison had provided Native Americans with food, clothing, tools, even fuel for fires. And it's been said that the military actually would give free ammunition out to the buffalo hunters and encourage them to go out and kill as many bison as they could. As you can see from this slide, the bison really were a veritable commissary and tool chest. The blood was used for paintings and puddings and puddings and soups. The tails, fly swatters, medicine, switches, whips. The hair, I understand, was even used for wigs. And so it really was one-stop shopping, if you will. Now, while there were more than a few people who didn't want to see bison wiped off the landscape, I focus on 4 in my book: Charles Buffalo Jones, Charles Goodnight, William Temple Hornaday, and Theodore Roosevelt. And as we go along, we have to remember that history is not always neat and tidy. Indeed, while those 4 men are credited with playing valuable roles in preserving bison on the landscape, they also were buffalo hunters before they were buffalo saviors. Buffalo Jones was an interesting character. He grew up on his parents' farm in Illinois, and he worked there helping with the livestock and the chores around the farm. One day he was walking in the forest nearby and he saw a squirrel up in a tree. I believe it was a fox squirrel. And so young Jones climbed up into the tree and grabbed this squirrel, and somehow he managed to tame the squirrel to the point where when Jones went to town, the squirrel would ride on his shoulder. And one day while he was walking through town, Jones was approached by a gentleman who offered him $2 for that squirrel. Now, for a 12-year-old boy, $2 back in the early 1800s was a windfall. And so he quickly sold the squirrel to the gentleman for $2. And at the same time, he recognized that as much as he loved wildlife, wildlife could provide him with some money in his pocket. Now, as he grew into a young man, he headed further west and into Kansas, where he got into ranching and whatnot. And it was during the blizzard of March 1886. Shortly after that blizzard, he rode out across the prairie, and everywhere he glanced, he could see dead cattle, but he didn't see a single dead bison. And so he figured that, bison were a truly hardy species that could endure this type of weather on the plains. And he figured that if he could cross bison with cattle, he could produce a hardier livestock species that wasn't quite as cantankerous as the wild bison were. Unfortunately, his idea for crossing, while he was able to create some hybrid animals, it really didn't turn into a profitable endeavor for him. That said, some of the after effects of his experiments could actually be seen down on Grand Canyon National Park on the North Rim. The cattle that roam there carry cattle genes, and those genes were the result of Jones's experimentation. And I've been told, and I've seen some photos from years gone by of some of those bison that look kind of strange. Some of them have more the profile of a cow, and some of them actually have white faces like a Hereford might have. Jones, always looking to make some money, was kind of an eccentric gentleman. In 1897, he had heard that muskox in Canada were going extinct. And he figured that if he could capture some muskox, he could take them to California, put them on a boat, sail them to some islands, probably today's Channel Islands National Park, and breed them and basically repopulate Canada with muskox. And so he and a colleague went into the Arctic up in northern Canada with this plan to capture some muskox. And the Aboriginal peoples made it very clear to Jones that he would not be leaving Canada alive with his muskox. And so he went home empty-handed. 1902 found Jones in Yellowstone National Park, where he was brought in as the game warden of sorts. And one of his chief assignments was to take the 23 or 24 bison that had survived the Great Slaughter by hiding out in the Central Plateau of Yellowstone. It was up to Jones to try and breed more of those bison and to increase their numbers beyond just 24. And Jones must have had a little knowledge of science, because he did worry about inbreeding and what problems that might create. And so he reached out to some ranchers up in northern Montana, Pablo Allard, and we'll get into them in a little bit. And he bought some bison from them to bring down to the Yellowstone operation. And he reached out to Texas to Charles Goodnight, and he bought some bison from Goodnight that he brought up. And so that was the start of what we see on the landscape in Yellowstone today of roughly 4,000 bison, thanks to Jones in large part, by bringing in those other bison strains, he was able to ensure that inbreeding wasn't a problem. Charles Goodnight, you're probably familiar with him either from the Lonesome Dove miniseries of the last century or from knowing about the Goodnight Loving Trail, which was basically a cattle trail that wound from Texas up through Colorado and the mining camps there up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And Charles Goodnight and all over Loving would trail their cattle and sell them along the way. Now, Goodnight headed into Texas to set up his ranch, and he headed to Palo Duro Canyon. And he thought this was an ideal place for his ranch because it had great grass, it had reliable water sources, and it was a canyon. And so it was a little bit easier to fence it in and constrain his cattle from fleeing too far. But when he got there in 1876, he saw that there were roughly 10,000 bison in Palo Duro Canyon that he had to move out first before he could move his cattle in. His wife encouraged him that while he was moving those bison out, that perhaps he should hold on to a few and start his own little bison herd. And Goodnight took that up. And it was a good thing because when the railroads blazed their path to the west, they basically cut the bison herd in half. To the north of the railroad tracks was what we had called the northern herd of bison. To the south of those tracks was the southern herd. And Goodnight's operation basically preserved the genetic remnants of the southern herd. And so it was a valuable practice for him to have his own little bison herd along with his cattle. Like Jones, he tried to cross bison with cattle, and he had some success, but again, it really didn't turn into a going venture for him. William Temple Hornaday was an interesting character. Like Jones, he fell in love with wildlife at an early age, and he actually was a hunter and turned wildlife conservationist and naturalist. From his boyhood love of wildlife, that led him to go to college to become a taxidermist. And shortly after he graduated, he got a job with a firm in upstate New York. And that company basically sent him around the world to kill animals and bring their hides back to the company that they could be mounted and sold to museums and universities for display. After that stint, Hornaday found himself at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where he was a taxidermist. And by early 1886, he was starting to hear word that the bison herds were vanishing from the West. And he was concerned not only because of the loss of the species, but because of the Smithsonian's own bison mounts were rather tawdry and in bad shape. And he figured that he better get some more before they vanished from the landscape. And so it's kind of ironic that while he was concerned about the species going extinct, that didn't stand in his way from going out there and killing a few more. And he actually was successful in 1886. He had 2 trips out there, one in the spring. He decided that wasn't the best time to be collecting bison herds or bison robes because it was the time when the animals were shedding and the robes weren't in the best condition. And so he went back west in the fall of that year and up into Montana and was able to come back with, I think, 20 or 22 bison. By 1896, Hornaday again was transitioning to a different job, and he found himself hired as the first director of the New York Zoological Society, which today is known as the Wildlife Conservation Society. Soon thereafter, Hornaday was approached to help form the American Bison Society, which existed, as you might imagine, to further interest of bison and increase their population across the West. And they made Theodore Roosevelt an honorary president of this organization. And one thing that really is amazing, when you can pick up a cell phone today and you can call somebody across the world in a matter of seconds, back in the 1880s, all these men, Goodnight, Hornaday, Jones, Roosevelt, they were all in touch with each other. And, however long it took the mail to get to one another, it's really amazing how connected they were and how concerned they really were about the plight of the bison. Now, as president of the society, Hornaday had a strategy that he used to increase bison numbers across the landscape. he would approach the federal government and say, if you build us a refuge, we will bring you the bison. At the New York Zoological Society, Hornaday had his own little zoo of sorts. It was a precursor to the Bronx Zoo of today. And he actually had his own little bison herd there. He had obtained bison from private herds in the Northeast and East. And he had about 4 dozen bison. And so he would approach the government and say, I've got the bison. If you give us the land, we'll set you up with bison. And the first time they did that was in 1907 out in Oklahoma at the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. Hornaday, like Goodnight and Jones, was aware of the problems of inbreeding. And so he was very careful in picking the bison from his own private stock, so to speak, and seeing that there was a good diversity of genes going out there. Now, in 1907, he sent 15 bison out to Wichita Mountains Reserve. 6 years later, in 1913, he did it again. The American Bison Society had identified some land in western Dakota's territory. Today, it's present-day South Dakota at Wind Cave National Park. And again, he picked out 14 bison from his own Bronx Zoo herd, put them on some railroad cars in late November of 1913, and they were shuttled out to Hot Springs, South Dakota, where they were unloaded one night and put on a variety of trucks and wagons and hauled up to Wind Cave National Park. Of course, back then it wasn't a park just yet. Theodore Roosevelt also played a key role, although not as much hands-on with saving bison as the other gentlemen, but again, a very important role. He was born into a wealthy family in New York City, never really had to want for anything, had plenty of money. He was really admired his father, who he viewed as a very stout man who could do anything he wanted to accomplish. And Roosevelt wanted to train himself. He had been a sickly boy, and he wanted to build his body up like his father had. And so when he was a young man, shortly after he was married, he got on a train and went out to the Dakotas Territory. And this was in September of 1883, shortly after he was married. And he rode the train as far west as he could go, and it got off at Medora, South Dakota today. And of course, Medora is the gateway town to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Now, he had kept his wife informed about what he was doing, and one of the things he had planned to do was to kill a bison. He was worried that the frontier was taming the West and wiping out the wildlife, and he wanted to get out there and experience it before it was gone, and along the way, hopefully toughen himself up. When he was out there, he used his family's money to buy 2 ranches. His first was the Maltese Cross Ranch. You can see the cabin that he lived in at the national park at the south entrance, and also the Elkhorn Ranch, which was a much larger spread along the Little Mississippi River. That's also in the national park today. Unfortunately, the home that he built there does not exist anymore, although if you travel there, you will see the big foundation rocks that were brought in on which to build his home. Anyway, he was there roughly a week, and he'd finally spotted the bison he wanted to kill. As he wrote back to his wife, "Hurrah! The luck has turned at last. I will bring you home the head of a great buffalo bull and the antlers of 2 superb stags." He told Alice in his letter that he had crawled up to the edge of a ravine, not 30 yards from the great grim-looking beast, and sent a shot from the heavy rifle into him just below his shoulder, the ball going clean through his body. He dropped dead before going 100 yards. Now, Roosevelt spent a number of years out there. In the summer, he would go back east during the winters, but he wrote a lot, and he thought a lot about wildlife. And one of the things that he wrote towards the end of his days in the Dakotas was that the extermination of the buffalo has been a veritable tragedy of the animal world. If you go to New York City, find yourself there, go out to Long Island and Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, which was Roosevelt's summer home, and you'll be able to see that bison bull that he killed along with the 2 stags. Now, the role that he played in helping the bison survive, when he was president, Hornaday kept the pressure up on Roosevelt to see that the federal government provided the land and the resources to make the bison refuges possible. Also playing a role in the survival of the bison today were two Montana men of mixed blood, Michelle Pablo and Charles Allred, who started out with about a dozen bison in 1884 and built up a herd of hundreds of animals. And this was just south of present-day Glacier National Park, probably in the Kalispell area. Now, Allred died in 1896, and by 1907, Pablo had decided to put up the rest of their herd for sale. And at first, they offered it to the United States government. Hornaday thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to bring not only more animals into the national bison herds, but also more genetic diversity. Unfortunately, the federal government didn't want to buy those bison, and instead, Allred sold them to Canada. And we'll see what happened to that in a little bit. Now, the American Bison Society was definitely at the forefront of building federally owned herds of bison, but it was not the only protector. By January 1st, 1908, Hornaday was able to list hundreds of bison found in national parks, state parks, zoos, and private lands, or private herds rather. Today, Interior Department wildlife biologists have been working to decipher all the genetic lines in the federally managed herds. It's generally thought that coming out of the Great Slaughter of the late 1800s, that most remaining bison were held in just 5 or 6 herds. Those herds ranged from Goodnight's bison in Texas. Jones had some in Kansas. There was the Pablo Allred herd in Montana. And of course, the Bronx Zoo herd that Hornaday had put together. Other genetic lines can be traced to a herd in South Dakota, as well as the McKay-Alloway herd from southern Saskatchewan. Inbreeding. Why didn't inbreeding cripple those Yellowstone bison? I mean, when you're only looking at 23 or 24 animals. I was curious about that myself as I researched the book, and I reached out to Dr. James Dare, a wildlife veterinarian at Texas A&M University. He told me that had the number of bison remained that low for 30 or 40 years, that inbreeding very likely would have been detrimental to their survival. But it didn't, thanks to Goodnight, Jones, Pablo Allred, along with Hornaday to a great extent, all succeeded in blending those remaining bison genes and providing the diversity that we needed today to see the species continue on. Today, bison are viewed as iconic animals, and they should be. I mean, after all, they should have vanished from the earth a couple of times through the ice ages. I mean, after all, we don't see saber-toothed tigers or dire wolves or American lions on the landscape. No, the bison survived. They survived, and they acclimated, and they evolved. And in 2016, they were designated as a national mammal of the United States. You can find them pictured on the Interior Department's official logo and on the National Park Service shield. And from time to time, they even come to national attention. After the partial government shutdown early in 2018, bison actually made headlines. More recently, the National Park Service took some time to create a descriptor slide. So we knew exactly what parts of the bison we should avoid, such as that danger flag, the tail, because when bison are agitated, that tail goes up. And of course, do not bop the bison's nose. And then there's the big stabbies. Now, joking aside, bison are noble animals. They're matriarchal in society, and they're not afraid to stand up to predators. Not even a pack of wolves in Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park. As rich as the history blazed by Jones, Hornaday, Goodnight, and Roosevelt is, so too is the history being made today thanks to the Interior Department's Bison Initiative. Today, a dozen years after Secretary Kempthorne had launched the federal government's Bison Initiative, the wildlife biologists are working to catalog the genetic integrity of the federal herds and identify locations on federal lands where bison might thrive. Tribal cultures are also very interested in building their own bison herds. The animals are revered by North American cultures, which have long connections to bison. The Lakota Sioux, for instance, believe bison came out of a cleft in a hillside in today's Wind Cave National Park. and welcomed humans to the world. Bison not only reconnect native cultures to their past, but they also fill an ecological niche and nutritional role for native cultures. Today, some 15 native cultures are interested in stewarding their own bison herds. The Fort Peck Reservation in Montana has played a key role in making this possible. They take in bison from Yellowstone that have been deemed free of brucellosis, and on the Fort Peck Reservation, they manage those bison for another year to make sure they are free of brucellosis, and then they distribute them. The Wind River Reservation in Wyoming celebrated the return to that landscape not too long ago. Today, there are about 500,000 bison on North American landscape. Though that number seems large, it really pales to the tens of millions of animals that once roamed the continent. And it seems even smaller when you realize that only about 20,000 of those animals are in conservation herds. Those are herds that are maintained for their genetic integrity. But not everyone is excited to see more bison on public lands. In northern Montana, really not too far from where Hornaday killed his bison back in 1886, the nonprofit American Prairie Reserve is working to build up a buffalo herd of roughly 10,000 animals. But there's current concern within the cattle industry there that they'll be pushed out. Back in 2019, Montana's Republican-dominated legislature passed a joint resolution asking the U.S. Bureau of Land Management to deny American Prairie Reserve's petition to modify 18 BLM grazing leases covering roughly 250,000 acres to replace cattle on those acres with bison. In September 2019, responding to that local opposition, reserve officials scaled back the request to 48,000 acres. So things have slowed quite a bit with that initiative. This slide from the Interior Department is a little dated, not too much, but a little, but it shows where many of the conservation herds are. I mean, you've got the National Bison Range up in Montana, you've got Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, Badlands and Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, of course, Yellowstone and Grand Teton in Wyoming, even Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. Where might bison end up if this bison initiative is successful? Well, at Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, officials there already have put together their bison management plan, and there have been some bison wandering onto the national park from a nearby ranch, and those bison do contain cattle genes. And so if the decision is made to put bison on Great Sand Dunes National Park, first those existing bison will have to be removed, and then we'll have to bring in some bison from the federal herds to populate the national park. Valles Caldera National Preserve in New Mexico also has been identified as a possible landing zone for a bison herd. National grasslands, these are lands managed by the U.S. Forest Service. There's roughly 4 million acres total. And the Little Missouri National Grassland, for example, actually surrounds Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. And so it really wouldn't be that difficult to move bison from Theodore Roosevelt and let them roam across the national grasslands of the Little Missouri, which covers about 1 million acres. Another area in South Dakota, Buffalo Gap National Grasslands. This grasslands touches Badlands National Park. In fact, it almost encircles the entire north and south units of the park. The south unit, of course, is neighboring the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. But you can imagine Badlands National Park with their bison, if they were allowed to roam out onto the Buffalo Gap National Grassland, possibly down onto the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And not too far to the west is Wind Cave National Park with their bison herds. And so you can dream of the day when that whole landscape contains bison on it. Now, one of the interesting things I found personally as I researched this project was in how the flow of bison genes was circular. I mean, in the late 1800s, when their private reserves were being assembled back east, you had bison going from the Dakotas back east. And now, of course, they're heading back west to the Wichita Mountains Refuge and more recently, Wind Cave National Park. While the Pablo Allard herd went to Alberta, Canada, they're returning. The Blackfeet Nation in northern Montana next to Glacier National Park has been obtaining bison from Elk Island National Park, where the Pablo Allard herd went. And so basically you have the descendants of that Pablo Allard herd coming back to the landscape that their forefathers once roamed. As I was working on this book, of course, I had to go out into the parks and see some of these wonderful landscapes. And one of the places I went was Wind Cave National Park, because I wanted to see where they had released the bison on the park landscape. As I was leaving the park, I went to the northern section of the park and was able to capture some video of bison moving across the landscape in the spring. It was late May of 2018. And if you listen carefully, you might be able to hear some of the bison chattering along and bellowing, but it doesn't seem that it's working on this one. Never fails. It works in the pre-production, but when you bring it out. Anyway, I was on the northern boundary of Wind Cave National Park, filming this bison just walking along. And all I had to do was turn around and gaze into Custer State Park. And here was the northern fringe of that bison herd just roaming around. And so it really is a fascinating setting to see these animals behaving like their ancestors did on the landscape. Where do things stand today? Quite a lot has transpired since my book came out in September of 2019. A year ago, after nearly 8 years of study, Montana officials agreed to allow wild bison to once again roam their state. But at the same time, they said that more study had to be done to make sure they had careful decisions on where those bison can be let loose to roam. While wildlife groups applauded the decision to open Montana to free roaming bison, they were also perplexed by the decision to put off identifying areas of Montana where that could actually happen. In other words, it still could be years before wild bison are seen roaming in Montana. Indeed, there's a new administration in Helena, one that is seen by some as agreeable to reversing that decision. In May 2020, then Interior Secretary David Bernhardt announced a decade-long initiative to support efforts to better understand genetic pools held within the Interior Department's roughly 11,000 bison, and to bolster conservation and ecological efforts with states and tribes. The announcement built on that bison conservation initiative that former Interior Secretary Dirk Kempthorne launched back in 2008. The Department of Interior's Bison Working Group, which is made up of scientists from the Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, and other federal agencies, is working on landscape-level collaborative conservation and restoration issues, and working with a range of partners for additional bison transfers, as well as continued bison health and genetic studies. Under the 2020 Bison Conservation Initiative, one goal is to develop an interagency science-based approach to support genetic diversity across the Interior Department bison conservation herds. Such work would ensure that when Interior does create new herds, such as the one envisioned at Great Sand Dunes or Valles Caldera, that bison from several herds with a diversity of genes will be brought together and there create a herd that has diverse biological genetics. Yellowstone National Park, in the years since I wrote my book, has been able to transfer more bison to Fort Peck Reservation in Montana. Since April 2019, at least 104 bison have been successfully transferred to the reservation under a program that diverts brucellosis-free Yellowstone bison from slaughter to tribal-led restoration efforts. Following their relocation at Fort Peck, the bison, as I said, remain in quarantine for 1 year for a final test for brucellosis. Once the transferred bison complete their final tests at Fort Peck, they're made available for translocation to other tribal herds, aiding with the continuing restoration of the species throughout its historic range. More recently, getting ahead of myself. After I left Wind Cave and Custer State Park, I drove across the Thunder Basin National Grassland in Wyoming to get an idea of what the shortgrass prairie looked like hundreds of years ago, and to see a possible landscape where bison could be returned. Of course, one of the big stumbling blocks or barriers to that ever happening is that the national grasslands are used by cattle associations and grazing allotments for cattle. And so what to do with those allotments would have to be dealt with before we'd ever see bison come back. More recently, this past November, we saw 100 bison from Badlands and Theodore Roosevelt National Parks released on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota. The bison marked the first of an estimated 1,500 bison that the tribe hopes to manage on 28,000 acres of grasslands that once were grazed by livestock. Other recent news involving bison, there's a pending lawsuit that asks that the Fish and Wildlife Service study whether Yellowstone bison should be protected under the Endangered Species Act. The plaintiffs maintain that the genetic purity of Yellowstone's bison is threatened by disease, hunting, habitat loss, mismanagement, and the risk of the introduction of cattle genes into their populations. Bison at Badlands National Park in South Dakota have gained an additional 22,000 acres in the park to roam, and visitors could have a better chance of seeing the iconic animals that are heading back onto the ground that their kind hasn't been seen on since the 1870s. There are roughly 1,200 bison roaming the western end of the park's north unit, and while a fence had blocked them from moving east, that fence was removed in October 2019. This photo was taken on the day that the bison were released onto that eastern section. Now, just last month, 10 bison were sent from the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at Colorado State University to the Southern Plains Land Trust, which protects more than 30,000 acres in southeastern Colorado as a preserve for native flora and fauna. These genetically pure bison represent the beginning of the trust's conservation herd and another step in the recovery of this species. And with the Comanche National Grasslands nearby, there's more room to roam, at least in theory. Now, at the end of the day, you might consider this closing message from the folks in the Midwest region of the National Park Service.
Hello, Kurt. Thank you. Excellent presentation. Let me applaud you for that.
You're kind. Like I said, I was going to stumble around.
You didn't. I think you enlightened us both on the history and the current conservation efforts regarding bison. As I think folks might be aware, we do have a Q&A function at the bottom, I believe, of your Zoom screen. And we've got a number of questions. We've got some time. And you've provoked thought by folks. Let me see if I can run through the questions and have you respond to them.
Just easy ones.
Okay. Well, I'll start. Let's see. Here at the top, much of the local opposition to the American Prairie Reserve it focuses on claims of the threat of brucellosis. What's the current scientific consensus regarding the threat of brucellosis transfer from bison to cattle in that area?
You know, I really haven't heard about the concern of brucellosis at American Prairie. Indeed, they're extremely cautious in the bison that they accept onto the Prairie Reserve. Once upon a time, they would take bison from Wind Cave National Park. But a few years ago, there was a study that it never was peer reviewed to the best of my knowledge, but there was a study that indicated that the Wind Cave bison did indeed have cattle genes on them. And so the American Prairie folks stopped bringing in bison from Wind Cave, and they focused on the Elk Island bison instead. I hadn't heard about the concern of brucellosis up there. I know there was concern that American Prairie might force ranchers to sell their land to be part of their preserve, because the idea is stitching together federal, state, tribal, and private lands together would form a landscape for 10,000 bison. But the American Prairie people tell me that they only buy from willing sellers. So maybe that's something I should look into, whether brucellosis is a concern.
Okay, great. Several people are interested in the question about the genetic characteristics of the bison that are here in our backyard on Antelope Island. Are they part of any of the herds that you mentioned? And do they have genetic purity, or are they interbred?
They are descended from Yellowstone National Park bison. That's where they got the source stock, if you will, and also the the bison down in the Henry Mountains. I believe those also were brought from Yellowstone. The question about brucellosis, one of the interesting things I stumbled upon as I was researching my book, that Henry Mountains herd, they exist side by side with cattle, and they haven't seen any transmission of brucellosis from the cattle herds to the bison herds. So it might be the bark is a lot worse than the bite. I don't know.
We've got a question asking that is rebisoning hampered by state laws that classify bison as livestock rather than as wildlife. Is there anything that can be done to reclassify them as wildlife? And is this a common problem or not in terms of classification of bison under state law?
The one place I ran into that was again up in Montana with the American Prairie Reserve, because some of the lands that they run bison on adjoin or come close to the Charles Russell National Wildlife Refuge. And interestingly enough, in Montana, bison had been categorized as livestock and so fell under livestock laws. And Charles Russell, they're treated as wildlife. And I think this action back in 2019 to allow bison to be free roaming in Montana one day might have addressed that issue. I have to bring myself up to date on that, I must say. But it's an interesting issue because the Blackfeet Reservation treat bison as wildlife. And so if a bison roams off of the Blackfoot Reservation onto state lands, is it wildlife or is it livestock? It's a good question. It's a good problem, but I've only heard of that in Montana.
Right. Well, I do know, I can add to this, that Montana, in the midst of the early days of the Yellowstone bison brucellosis controversy, created those two categories, one of bison as wildlife, one of bison as livestock. And that latter category was tied into the potential for disease transmission. Their laws have undergone some change, but those two categories still remain today in Montana. Another question, the three men you described early on were aware of the inbreeding risks and sought to avoid them. What was the science at that point in time? What criteria did they use to promote genetic diversity, and how they select the bison to ship out?
That's a good question that I really can't provide a good answer with. My only supposition is that, Jones and Goodnight were ranchers, and so they're familiar with raising cattle and the issues with inbreeding there and how to breed for a superior animal. So I guess they took it from the ranching backgrounds, but I really can't say.
Okay. So do you have an opinion on the commercial operations like Wild Idea in South Dakota, where they're raising bison to harvest and sell the meat commercially, but at the same time using conscientious techniques and with the goal of restoring native grasslands? Is that an operation you're familiar with? And are there similar sorts of things, and are they helpful in terms of the ultimate conservation goals?
I'm not familiar with Wild Idea specifically. I am aware of quite a few bison operations. Indeed, I'm on a Facebook group of bison ranchers, and the National Bison Association actually has a code that they expect their members to follow in terms of raising bison. And one of the things that Dr. Dare at Texas A&M told me is that a lot of these bison operators, they don't like to use a lot of antibiotics and hormones and try and design the perfect bison for ranching opportunities. They prefer to run bison as natural as possible. And I think it's a good thing that we have these commercial operations, because on one hand it does help the species continue to survive on the landscape. And the meat is a lot healthier than beef for all of us to eat. I know that's one of the big things the Wind River Reservation told me, is that they wanted to get bison for their people because it's a good source of protein, and it doesn't have as much fat as beef does. As far as good for the landscape, I have a number of books in my library, and one of them talks about migratory bird species. And it specifically mentioned that this one bird species, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, as it was going from South America up to Canada and whatnot, it would stop on lands grazed by bison, because bison are like little rototillers, and they turn over the land as they're moving along. And they bring to the surface a lot of insects and whatnot. And you don't see that so much in cattle. I mean, bison are always moving, as the videos of Wind Cave showed.
Right. Thanks. Another question is, I'll try to paraphrase, poses the issue of whether or not bison reintroduction in Montana or elsewhere has any partisan political overtones, splitting Democrats and Republicans on this particular conservation issue. Have you observed anything like that? Is that something we should be concerned about moving forward? Is there a way to address it if so?
I haven't really observed that specifically as an issue, other than knowing that, Montana is a conservative state and Wyoming is a conservative state. And, their ranching industries in both those states are really large and have significant voices. And I think the concern over the possible spread of brucellosis from bison to cattle is a larger issue. Ironically, it's been proven that bison aren't the main transmitter of brucellosis from bison to livestock operations in Wyoming or Montana. Rather, it is elk moving out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and into those states. The national feedlots and the state feedlots create the problem with transmission from elk to elk. And as those elk move out, they carry the brucellosis with them, and they bring them closer to livestock. Now, what's interesting in Montana is they've actually come up with a system to identify elk herds with brucellosis in them, and they're able to track them. And so they can alert a rancher to when, there's brucellosis carrying elk coming your way.
Right. I was aware that the National Academy of Science report that came out about a year to 2 years ago pinpointed elk as a principal source of transmission in the Yellowstone area. I believe that the bison have not yet been linked to a case of brucellosis in cattle at this point, although that continues to be the concern. Question, what are some of the larger ecosystem ripple effects when bison are returned to natural areas where they've been absent? Does it change how predators behave or anything else?
One thing, as I mentioned a little while ago, about how bison go across the landscape and turn it over and bring different insects and whatnot, and grubs and worms to the surface that birds like to feed on. But, one of the big differences between cattle and live and bison are that, bison always seem to be on the move. And whereas, cattle will sometimes, settle down around a water source and just stay in the immediate area. And as bison move across the landscape, they graze in different patterns, and they create kind of a mosaic that actually has been deemed helpful in stopping wildfires from spreading across the landscape. And of course, as I said, they rototill across the landscape as they go, and this is helpful to a number of migratory birds and native bird species. Also, by the way, they graze in maintaining the shortgrass prairie. It's beneficial to a lot of native birds that evolved alongside with them in the prairies.
Right. In terms of predators, I know that in the Yellowstone area, although wolves will depredate on bison, their preferred prey is elk up there. I suppose because bison are not that easy to take down unless you get a sick one.
It's a good challenge, although in the interior of the park, they do have that one wolf pack that has figured out how to take down bison. What's interesting, we heard the president announce yesterday, I think it was, about the 30 by 30 initiative, and he wants to see more landscapes both land and waterscapes that the federal government owns preserved for nature going forward by 2030. One of the things that we're seeing at American Prairie Reserve and what we might see at the Southern Land Trust in Colorado, these areas are being restored or attempted to be restored back to their natural conditions. And so along with bringing bison back, we're seeing some of the native vegetation thrive more. And we're also seeing the introduction of predators. At American Prairie, they've spotted wolves crossing their landscape. And the last time I talked to them, they said some grizzly bears were denning not too far from American Prairie. And so, those big conservation areas really do good for nature. In researching my book, I asked Dan Wenk, who at the time was still superintendent of Yellowstone, I asked him if the age of big conservation initiatives was over with because of the fragmentation of the landscape out there. And he didn't think so. I mean, he just looked out his window and looked out across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where you do have that quilt of public lands and state lands. And he was still confident that we haven't seen the end of big conservation efforts. And with efforts like American Prairie and the Southern Land Trust, maybe he's absolutely right.
That's certainly an optimistic note. And related to that, one of the questions raises the matter of the Buffalo Commons idea that floated some 20, 30 years ago by the two professors back from New Jersey, the Poppers, if I recall the name correctly.
You do.
And
great state of New Jersey.
Yes. Is that an issue that's surfaced in connection with the rebisoning effort that you've spoken about?
I haven't heard it put in that context so much. As I was researching my book, I did run across a gentleman who was pushing an initiative, and he might have been the only one pushing it, to see a national park created in Nebraska that would preserve the shortgrass prairie and be a great place for bison to return to. And he envisioned it as connecting the Niobrara National Scenic River with, I believe, a TNC ranch, the Nature Conservancy Ranch, of I think 56,000 acres. And it's a new idea today, but actually back in the 1930s, the National Park Service studied the concept of a Great Plains National Park in Nebraska or in Kansas. And in the end, local opposition pushed it back. And so I think the same project would face the same risks these days. I mean, there's a lot of concern over losing private property rights. There's concerns about having a 2,000-pound bison come through your garden or knock down your fence. And so, they face some tough odds.
We're going to need some serious open space in order to proceed with this movement, whether it's public or private. Question about our Pittman-Robertson funds being used for bison restoration. Those are funds generated, I believe, through revenues connected to hunting activities.
Again, I'm afraid I have no idea on that one.
Okay. I know they're used to provide support for the National Wildlife Refuges. Not sure if they're used beyond that and specifically. You talked about the gene flow from cattle to bison and concern about maintaining pure bison. What effect do we know that cattle genes might have on bison fitness? Do they negatively impact the bison, or is it simply a genetic mixing that occurs?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I pose that to some of the researchers as I worked on my book. And at the time, there didn't seem to be a really definitive answer to that. But one thing you have to realize is that bison have the ability to really slow down their metabolism in the winter. And that's something that really helps them survive those cold blizzards. And cattle don't have that same ability to do that. And so you have to be concerned about the threat that the cattle genes will somehow affect that metabolism in the bison to endure the winter weather and the cold and snow and whatnot. Yeah.
Well, I certainly know one of the more astonishing scenes I recall seeing many years ago was the dead of winter up in the Old Faithful area in Yellowstone, and the bison out there in 20 to 30 below zero, looking for just shreds of grass that were buried under a couple feet of snow, and that big head just moving around in the snow, trying to get down to find something to eat, and at the same time surviving those extreme temperatures and that extreme circumstance.
You know, and also one other thing, Professor, there is a community of thought out there that as genetic testing becomes even more evolved than it is today, we may never find a bison that is 100% bison genes. You know, and that's one thing that I'm looking forward to these studies that the Interior Department teams are doing to see what they come up with and see if they can trace exactly where those 5 or 6 foundational herds ended up and what the mix of genes is.
We've got a question. How are the other federal land management agencies, BLM, the Forest Service, and even the states, dealing with bison on their lands? Are they welcome? Is hunting available if they're there? Those sorts of questions.
You know, right here in Utah, I think it's a great example of how the states can be involved with returning bison to the landscape. Obviously, down at the Henry Mountains, they've got a thriving herd that's been there for quite a few decades. And recently, they started moving a herd, I believe, into the Book Cliffs, where the Ute Reservation has its own bison herd. And so we're seeing some good cooperation between the state and tribal agencies in managing bison. And some operations, I do believe, allow bison hunts on them to raise money. I can't put my brain on examples right now, but I have heard of a few, I think, tribal agencies that offer hunts throughout the year to raise money for their operations.
And we've got some questions sort of linked, you know, where we have these, if you will, sort of smaller areas with bison, like Antelope Island, like in the Henry Mountains. Are they intensively managed? Is there culling that's going on? Are you familiar with how the state or whomever is proceeding with management? Is it intensive? Are they, like in Yellowstone, you know, given more or less free reign on the landscape?
You know, Antelope Island, each fall they do cull the herd to bring the numbers down. That Henry Mountains herd, now that I think about it, they also manage the herd to a certain number, and they do that in part through hunting. They'll sell some permits for bison taking down there in the Henry Mountains.
In terms of managing the herds, is natural predation a potential tool for accomplishing those objectives, or is culling what's going to be necessary to keep herds in control?
I guess that depends on how many communities want a healthy wolf pack nearby.
Well, there may be quite a few in Colorado, from what I understand.
You know, the Colorado experiment is going to be fascinating. For those who hadn't heard, in November, Coloradans voted to have wolves brought back onto the landscape in the state. And it's going to be interesting to see how that project succeeds. I know Rocky Mountain National Park from time to time has spotted a lone wolf coming through. But it's an exciting experiment.
It will be. Certainly the urban areas of the state carried the day in that initiative that was on the ballot this last election. And now it's in the bailiwick of the state wildlife department to decide exactly how to proceed.
I think at the end of the day, Professor, that they would have to turn to hunting to cull the numbers. I just don't think in this day and age that we'll see the return of enough wolf packs to get the job done. Just like in Rocky Mountain National Park, they've got to cull the elk herd because there's not enough predators to keep the population in balance.
And certainly the wolves haven't made a significant impact on the bison numbers in the Yellowstone area.
No.
Here. Is there evidence of bison helping with rangeland health in comparison to cattle? Characterized as a green wave. Is that science or is that mythology these days?
Oh, I think it's science. I think it's science. I mean, the research shows that bison have a gentler impact on the landscape than cattle. They're always moving. They're grazing lands in these different mosaics that is beneficial to the vegetation, and it brings in different wildlife that benefit from them. There's an interesting relationship between bison and prairie dogs. And while cattle ranchers don't like prairie dogs because of the burrows that they create all over the place, and I saw this up at American Prairie Reserve, the prairie dogs are always going out and munching down the vegetation in their colonies. And so what that does is it's constantly producing green vegetation. And so the bison just love that. They just eat it up. And so you've got kind of this codependent relationship between bison and prairie dogs. Again, bison don't hang out for long around water sources. And so you don't have that trampling of the riparian habitat as much as you might with cattle or sheep.
Yes, that's, I think, an important point in terms of the difference between how they act on the landscape, the two species. Let's wrap it up. I've got one final question. The basic issue is, do you have any suggestions or recommendations of how one might get involved with bison restoration efforts, either generally or in specific locations?
Well, I know that American Prairie Reserve is always looking for volunteers, and the same with the Southern Land Trust in Southern Plains Land Trust in Colorado. Good places to reach out and say, how can I be involved? And it might just be, some sort of citizen science project to monitor bison on the landscape and see where they move and how they move and whatnot. But the Nature Conservancy has quite a few herds across the country. They'd be another good organization to reach out to and see what volunteer opportunities exist.
Great. Well, let me, Kurt, on behalf of everyone who tuned in, at one point we had 275 folks tuned in today. Let me thank you again. Let me remind those of you remaining that Kurt's book is available through the King's English Bookshop or elsewhere, I'm sure. Rebisoning of the West, as he noted at the beginning. Let me also invite you to join us again February 18th at the noon hour for Vision and Place, John Wesley Powell, and Reimagining the Colorado River Basin with Professor Robeson from University of Wyoming and Professors Adler, McCool, and myself from the University of Utah, addressing evolution of water, public land, and tribal roles in the Colorado River Basin. Again, thank you. We'll all go to bed dreaming of bison tonight, Kurt. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.